of course, with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise are you, God, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. Okay, so we've had an interesting run in the book of Numbers, and we have come to the end of the book of Numbers. We only have one book left, which means it's almost time for the high holidays, which means I'm already starting to think about what I should be talking about. If you have any ideas, feel free to add them to the chat, and I will put them in the box of possibilities as I start preparing.
What do you have for me?
Sorry?
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. All right. Yes, well, if everyone could just mute when not speaking. Okay, so we are at the end of the book of Numbers, and I was with you all a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Bilam and Balak, and we ended that portion with the story of Pinchas, the start of the story of Pinchas, and his zealous way in which he decided to support God by sticking a stake through two lovemaking people. And that continued, his saga continued last week in the Parsha Pinchas, where we also learn about the various groups as they are about to prepare to enter the land of Israel, because just to remember, the book of Numbers really is the end of the adventure. Deuteronomy, for the most part, is just a recap of everything that has come before, a preparation for what's going to happen when they enter the land of Israel after we finish the Torah, since that's not in the Torah itself. And so this really is the end of the journey. And then starting next week, we really get Moses's 3 speeches where he reminds people of the adventures that they've been on up until this point and prepares them for their future. So there are a couple of things that happen here at the very end. After we had Pinchas, we continue with the same story related to the Midianites, which we're going to look at. There are 2 things. Again, we're probably only going to get to the first thing, which is the battle with Midian, which is a disturbing story on a variety of levels. So I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about kind of Jewish concepts of war and warfare. And then if we have time, which we probably won't, we'll get to another section that comes in the second of the 2 Torah portions. Again, this is a double Torah portion. There's 7 times during the year, depending on the year, where you can get 2 Torah portions linked up together. And this is one of those. So Matot-Masei, it's actually 2 separate Torah portions, but this year they happen on the same Shabbat. So in Massei, which is the last of the Torah portions in Numbers, in addition to going through all the stages and stops on their journey, which is an interesting decision on the Torah's part to make sure that we articulate and declare every single stop on their journey from Egypt to the edge of the Promised Land. In addition to that, there is a section about cities of refuge for those who commit manslaughter. So if we have time, we'll get to that. We'll see what happens. Okay, so we begin with the battle for Midian. And so this isn't at the very beginning of the Torah portion itself, but towards the beginning of the Torah portion, we have this, it's broken up into 2 parts. I want to read through it so you understand the significance and the challenge that I feel, and I assume you feel it too, after you read through this in detail. How do you feel both about Moses, about the Israelites, and the Midianites, and is this appropriate or not? And how are we supposed to reconcile that? These are all the questions that go through my mind, and I would love your thoughts after we read it. So Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Avenge the Israelite people on the Midianites, then you shall be gathered to your kin." Remember, Moses already knows that he is going to die before he enters the land of Israel. And so God is letting him know, take care of the Midianite people, and as soon as that is taken care of, you shall be gathered to your kin. In other words, you will die. In other words, this is your last big act. Of course, we know that Deuteronomy, he has these speeches, but his last true act of leadership, so to speak, seems to be him avenging the Midianite people. Moses spoke to the militia, saying, "Let troops be picked out from among you for a campaign, and let them fall upon Midian to wreak Adonai's vengeance on Midian. You shall dispatch on the campaign 1,000 from every one of the tribes of Israel." So 1,000 from each tribe were furnished from the divisions of Israel, 12,000 picked for the campaign. Moses dispatched them on the campaign, 1,000 from each tribe, with Pinchas, from last week's Parsha, son of Eleazar, serving as a priest on the campaign, equipped with the sacred utensils and the trumpets for sounding the blasts. They took to the field against Midian. By the way, this makes it clear also, this is not just a military battle. This also seems to have some religious undertones to it, with Pinchas at the helm there with the sacred utensils and the trumpets. This is not just about military action. They took the field against Midian, as Adonai had commanded Moses, and slew every male. Along with their other victims, they slew the kings of Midian, Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also put Bilam, son of Beor, to the sword. Okay, so from 2 weeks ago, Bilam, who tried to curse the Israelites, ended up blessing them with the famous Matovu blessing that we have every time we enter the sanctuary. Here, even though he blessed us earlier, nope, not anymore. He is killed in this battle. The Israelites took the women and other non-combatants of the Midianites captive and seized as booty all their beasts, all their herds, and all their wealth. And they destroyed by fire all the towns in which they were settled and their encampments. They gathered all the spoil and all the booty, human and beast, and they brought the captives, the booty and the spoil, to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the Israelite community leadership at the camp in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho. Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the chieftains of the community came out to meet them outside the camp. Moses became angry with the commanders of the army, the officers of thousands and the officers of hundreds who had come back from the military campaign. And Moses said to them, "You have spared every female? Yet they are the very ones who, at the bidding of Bilam, induced the Israelites to trespass against Adonai in the matter of Peor, so that Adonai's community was struck by the plague. Now, therefore, slay every male among the non-combatants, and slay also every woman who has known a man carnally, but spare every female non-combatant who has not had carnal relations with the man." Okay, so this is just the first part. This is the most brutal part of the campaign. We have here the destruction of the Midianite people according to this text. And again, it's not historically accurate because the Midianites do come back in the book of Joshua and do fight against the Israelites once they enter the land. So this isn't about history. This is really about the Torah trying to tell us a story about the power of the Jewish people, to the point where they slew every man, and then they come back and they had spared the women, and Moses is the one who gets upset and refers back to what happened 2 weeks ago at the start of the Torah, at the end of the Torah portion, Balak, where Bilam had already said, "Beware, Israelites, you potentially are going to be tempted by those of other tribes to follow other gods." And as a result, the men start engaging sexually with the Midianite and Moabite women. And as a result, that's when Pinchas goes and kills one of them. But God gets upset as a result of them going and having carnal relations with others. And there is a plague that is beset upon the Israelites. So this seems to be God saying, go out, and because of all the problems that those Midianites caused earlier, I want you to take care of them. And then Moses, of course, going a step further and saying, it's not enough for you to kill all the men. I want you to go back and kill everyone who is either a male of any age, and make sure that there are no women who have had sex at all who are alive. Okay. Have people heard this? This is an interesting side of Moses that we get only a rare glimpse every once in a while. Another part that I always think about when I think about Moses's dark underbelly, so to speak, is after the golden calf. Does anyone remember what happens after the golden calf? Not just the smashing of the golden calf, but can anyone remind us of what happens, what Moses requires or declares after?
Yeah,
Yes.
they smash it up and they mix it up with some goop, and he has the people swallow it.
And then,
really,
and then what after that? Do you remember what he says after that?
Isn't there a plague then?
Well, then he goes to those who he says, anyone who was with me and stands by me, come stay with me, and now go kill the people who were engaged with the building of the golden calf, right? So it's a plague of sorts, but it's really a plague based on Moses directing the Levites to go out and kill their brethren, right? So that to me is another one of these moments where we get a sense of Moses's more passionate, negatively passionate side, but here seems to go even further, and so I want to keep going with it because it's not the end yet. I do want to say that here, Rashi talks about this, the vengeance of the Lord, and this is what I referred to when I mentioned that they say Pinchas was at the helm, because this idea that because whoever attacks Israel is as though he attacks the Holy One, blessed be he. Right. So there seems to be, and Rashi's interpretation of why we would go out and slaughter all these people is that anytime someone attacks Israel, or in this case, attacks them, not just physically, but attacks their essence of who they are and their belief system, it's basically an attack against God, and therefore you have every right to go after them. In other words, a holy war, so to speak. Sukasa.
To me, that sounds like just an excuse that Rashi's making for Moses. It seems to me inexcusable, and he's trying to just justify it because it's in the Torah.
Yeah, I think that would make sense. Again, Rashi coming from the place that everything in the Torah is important and necessary. And so you're not going to be, he can't go out and negate it. So what is the reasoning behind it, right? And that is the challenge we face with this passage and other passages in the Torah that sometimes get overlooked, which is we have these parts of the Torah that are dark, that are negative, that don't seem to speak at all to the Jewish values that we abide by. And so what are we supposed to do with that, right? And Rashi doesn't throw it out. He comes up with his reason. But I think what's also important for us to be thinking about, what I want you to be thinking about is, well, what are we supposed to take from this? What can we learn from this? Instead of just throwing it out and saying it's irrelevant, what are the lessons that we can learn from this? Okay, so it keeps going. Oh yeah, go ahead, Susan.
You know, our 20th century, 21st century looks at it so negatively, but I think we should also look at this as a protection of the values of the Torah, and the greatest threat was apostasy, and it's usually caused by sexual immorality. And I think if we see this as a kind of, what is it all about? What's the worst thing? Well, it wasn't go back and killing the Egyptians, although the Egyptians enslaved us. It was the sexual, the inducement to idolatry and polytheism that came about also from sexual liaisons, and would we see that as one of the highest moral failings, and leading to the polytheism, we're leading away from God, then we can see the extremes that we have here.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, David in a moment, but Susan seems to be suggesting, first of all, we have to take this in historical context.
That's correct.
And we have to remember that one of the things throughout the Torah, and especially we'll get a lot more of this in the book of Deuteronomy, coming right away with the Shema, by the way, coming from Deuteronomy, this idea of one God, our belief in one God, and let's not be swayed by all the other traditions around us who have multiple gods, right? Again, the modern day version of this would be intermarriage and our fear of intermarriage, right? This is, again, about how do you stay true to your religion and not fall off the wagon, so to speak. David, and then Peter.
Well, one of the confusions I think we're having is seeing Moses as a unitary figure. The Torah's got at least 5 strands. I mean, Moses' wife is a Midianite. His father-in-law is a Midianite priest and king who helped him at a key point in things. So this is written by a different person or people with a different purpose than other parts of Moses' story. So if we try and make all the strands, including the redacted strand, all make sense together, you're going to go nuts. So I think you have to say, okay, it has a singular purpose, but it has not fit together because it's not written by the same people for the same reasons.
Okay, and David, I agree, and that's a really important point. What is the purpose of this version of Moses then?
Well, this person is written by this probably at a historical time when the Israelites were threatened, and the writer of this, or the writers of this, thought we have to tell a story about how we fight for ourselves to keep ourselves together as a people. That's a perfectly good historical reason to write this, even though in retrospect it looks bad. I mean, it doesn't ring so nicely, but it certainly doesn't ring consistently with so many other things in the Torah. So I think you have to say, okay, the Torah is one thing, but it's one thing.
Great, thank you, David. Pnina.
I'm trying to look at it in a more practical way. Balak ben Avinoam, who was sent to curse them, they were about to attack the Israelites. He wasn't sent there to bless them. He blessed on his own thing, but actually he went to scout and see what's going on there because they were attacking the Israelites. So when Moses is trying to come up with all this defense stuff, it's the way I look at it, it's because there is a reason. There is a sentence that says, "Aba lehorgecha ashkem lehorgo." If you have the feeling or the suspicion that somebody is about to kill you, you have to do it first before he harms you. It's like if you see somebody accumulating guns today in a house, you're going to know that something bad is about to happen, and it does. So I don't think that this whole section is built just on an idea. I think it was built about a physical reaction to something that was happening to them. And the Midianites were fighting them and were attempting at least to destroy them. And we also know that as soon as they came to the country, the land, they weren't just accepted by open arms. They weren't allowed to use the water. They had to go to the mountains. They weren't allowed to even live among the people. That's why they settled in the mountains. So the whole idea that it's like out of his thin hair that Moses decides to do it, it's not. And that's it. It's very simple. Okay.
Great. Thank you. So it's all so simple, right?
It is. If you know somebody's building a tunnel, you're going to blow up the tunnel. They're not going to be able to get to you. That's it. Okay.
Okay, so it continues. Moses says, "You shall exact a levy for Adonai in the case of the warriors who engaged in the campaign. 1 item in 500 of persons, ox, asses, and sheep shall be taken from their half share and given to Eleazar the priest as a contribution to Adonai. And from the half share of the other Israelites you shall withhold 1 in every 50 human beings, as well as cattle, asses, and sheep, all the animals, and give them to the Levites who attend to the duties of Adonai's tabernacle." Moses and Eleazar the priest did as God commanded Moses. The amount of booty, other than the spoil that the troops had plundered, came to 675,000 sheep, 72,000 head of cattle, 61,000 asses, and a total of 32,000 human beings, namely the females who had not had carnal relations. Thus, the half share of those who had engaged in the campaign was as follows: the number of sheep, 337,500, and Adonai's levy from the sheep was 675. The cattle came to 36,000, from which Adonai's levy was 72, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Moses gave the contributions levied for Adonai to Eleazar the priest, as God had commanded Moses. As for the half share of the other Israelites, which Moses withdrew from those who had taken the field, that half share of the community consisted of all those animals and human beings. From this half share of the Israelites, Moses withheld 1 in every 50 humans and animals, and he gave them to the Levites, who attended to the duties of Adonai's tabernacle, as Adonai had commanded. Okay, so we have here not only the destruction of the Midianite people, but then taking the booty and seizing everything that they had, mostly, these animals and humans, giving some to God and some to the Levites. Right, so because the Levites did not participate in this campaign, and they are the ones who, as we will see later on in the next Torah portion, which we're probably going to get to so much, is this idea that they also get some cities for themselves in the Holy Land. Okay, so they took now David brought this up earlier, and I wanted to touch on this because even though, yes, it's probably true that there are multiple writers, multiple perspectives, we have to imagine that the writers of all the sections maybe had some understanding of the other pieces of the story and that they would know Moses's background. So here we have, they took the field against Midian as Adonai had commanded Moses and slew every male. But I want to go back just to remind us of the beginning of Moses's story. Now, this is right when Moses had fled Egypt after killing the Egyptians' taskmaster. And he comes to the desert. And now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense, and he watered their flock. And when they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" And they answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why did you leave the man? Ask him in to break bread." Moses consented to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah as wife. She bore a son whom he named Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." And then one other piece, Moses went back to his father-in-law, Jethro, he has multiple names, is the same person though, and said to him, "Let me go back to my kinsfolk in Egypt and see how they are faring." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." Adonai said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who sought to kill you are dead." So Moses took his wife and sons, mounted them on an ass, and went back to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the rod of God with him. Okay, so this is just a reminder of the background of Moses's really significant connection to the Midianite people, right? He marries a Midianite woman. His father-in-law, Jethro, not only supports him in the very beginning, but if you remember, the Torah portion that has the 10 commandments in it is called, the Torah portion is called Jethro. And that Torah portion begins with Jethro really helping Moses to recognize how he has to delegate authority. Okay, so even if we were to suggest that these are different people, I still think there's something significant and challenging that if we were to try and go into the mind of Moses, right? Is he coming from a place at this point in his journey? Now it's been many, many years since he's already now seen the Midianites in a negative light. I'm curious what people think of do you think he would go about this without any hesitation? How are we supposed to understand this leader who in some ways really you can't forget your past completely, and yet has this obligation to these people and to God, and yet as a result is now faced with having to slaughter the tribe that he is deeply connected to? Susan.
I think times change too. We're talking about a 40-year period or something over that. I mean, a recent example of a recent history is Germany and the Holocaust. And now Israel is in a good relationship with Germany. I mean, it's not the same, but on the other hand, I think I read somewhere in the Torah, even in the footnote, that the Midianites prevented the Israelites from crossing their land and using the king's highway. And there were, which you just brought up at the beginning, battles with the Midianites. So even though Yitro was terrific for Moses, and his wife Zipporah was with him. In fact, there's discussion of whether Yitro converted or joined the Israelites as well. Did he or didn't he? But times change and people can change too. And societies and cultures can change. I mean, we can even look at our own culture changing, some for the better, some for the worse, some in between. So I think we could give this a little bit of a historical perspective, even though the Bible isn't strictly historical, but intervening time and the change in the Midianites.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Great point. Sukasa.
I think if you look at it, and today, another way to look at it is they completely destroyed the land. You think of the Russians today, what they're doing in the Ukraine. They're just destroying for the sake of destroying. And you think about the Israelis who try not to bomb residential neighborhoods in Gaza, but they're forced to because a lot of the fighters are hiding there. So I find it a little hard to justify, if we're going to use those standards to justify what they did. I mean, it just, why destroy the entire people like that? Burn, it says they destroyed the land as well.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. You got any responses to that, David?
One of the reasons the Torah is so, this is ridiculous to say, so stupendously good, is because it doesn't fit together. And the spaces are as interesting, and the tensions between the parts are as instructive and illuminating and engaging. It's why you can read it every year, you can read it every day and never get tired of it, because it doesn't fit. So this is one of the great examples of it doesn't fit, and yet it's really gripping.
Great. Okay. Now I want to push you though, David. So it doesn't fit. What are we supposed to do with it? Just because it doesn't fit, why is it here? It doesn't fit into other things, but so what for us?
Well, if you take, I think that it presents ultimately a whole view of the world. And what Sukkot is saying, for example, is a modern day version of the whole world, right? And the Torah allows you to look at them at whatever time period you're in a context of this constructed piece with gaps and spaces. And it's in those, that's why there's a Talmud, right? And this is why there's 300 or 400 years of people going, no, what they really meant is because it's not clear what they meant. And that's the greatness of it. So what I'm really saying is this discussion seems to me to be right on the nose of what the Torah is about.
Right. And just to the black and white, so to speak, there is this idea that so much of the Torah is not in the black lettering, but it's in the white space behind it, right? Space in between. So you're talking about this idea of the gaps, and in the narratives and the gaps, that is, what we're doing here, what we struggle with is that idea of what is that white space in between all the letters that we fill in ourselves, right? We fill in our own historical context, in our own personal narratives and life stories, right? All of these things come in to give us a sense of, Moses's responsibility to the Midianites was his responsibility just to one person. How do we look at our own idea of who we are responsible for, who we are committed to in our own lives? How do those relationships change? How does the world change around us, etc.? Yeah, great. Thank you, David. Knina.
Am I muted?
Nope.
Okay,
Yeah, you're fine.
I am, okay. Okay, I'm looking at it also from the point that אין מוקדם ומאוחר בתורה. In the Torah, the stories are not necessarily in the right order, or we think that they are all coming in order as a response to something that happened before. Every chapter does not have to happen the way that you see it in the order the Torah tells it to you. These events could have been right after something that the Midianites did, maybe a book before. So when it was found, when it's collected, or when it was responded to, may not be the exact time where the cause happened to tell you about the effect. So take it in consideration.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So it seems as though, yeah, go ahead, Merle.
I'm just thinking, all of this, I think why one of the reasons that I want to take all these Torah study classes is that whatever's going on in the world now, we can, and maybe that's the beauty of Reform Judaism, that we get to interpret Torah in the light of what's happening today or tomorrow or whenever. And that, if I were to look back, because I take notes, because that's how I pay attention, if I were to look back at my notes a year ago, I think maybe we would all be thinking of something different as to how it fits in. And I think, I look at Moses, I kind of think Moses was angry from day one, and he just keeps carrying it till the end. I don't know that Moses was ever a happy person. I think Moses is just pissed off at whatever responsibilities he's given, even if people look at him and say, well, you're the right one. But then there are people in the real world who don't want any responsibilities. And when they have them, they get mad. So I look at it from a social worker's point of view that, you know, you have to put it, we weren't around 3,000 years ago. And we kind of have to interpret it as what's going on in whatever the real world is at that moment.
Great. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. Let's look at a little, just a few things. You know, there's not a lot in the Torah about warfare and tactics, or at least in terms of the value system and ethics behind warfare. There's some that comes a little later, but I did want to bring a few of them so you're aware that our tradition is not void of thinking about these things. It's more that you have to put it in the context. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But okay, so Deuteronomy we have, which we'll get to these in some weeks. But when you approach a town to attack it, you shall offer it terms of peace, right? So already one value, really important value that we have. And again, this is what Moses is speaking to the Israelites for when they enter the land of Israel. But it is also a value that we as Jews can uphold, right? And when you are about to attack, first offer peace, right? So again, we can think about this in both formal warfare. We can also think about this in terms of interpersonal warfare, so to speak, right? How do you go about engaging in relationships on a national level or individually or communally? And how do you make sure that you're offering terms of peace? Right, that our goal ultimately is not necessarily to destroy. It may be the result of, it may be something we have to do, but first, peace is of the utmost of importance, which we recognize in our tradition. We also have in the same chapter, when in your war against a city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it. You must not destroy its trees. This is a famous line, wielding the axe against them. You may eat of them, but you must not cut them down. Are trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? Okay, so maybe when we get to that point in Deuteronomy, if I'm the one teaching, we can go into more depth about this, but I wanted to bring you this idea when you are besieging a city and you are outside, the trees are not to be cut down and destroyed. One more passage, this one from Chronicles, and again about this kind of alludes to that war is not necessarily the ideal. This is David speaking. David assembled all the officers of Israel, the tribal officers, the divisional officers who served the king, the captains of thousands, the captains of hundreds, and the stewards of all the property and cattle of the king and his sons, with the eunuchs and warriors, all the men of substance to Jerusalem. He brings everyone together. King David rose to his feet and said, "Hear me, my brothers, my people. I wanted to build a resting place for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, for the footstool of our God, and I laid aside material for building. But God said to me, you will not build a house for my name, for you are a man of battles and have shed blood. The Lord, the God of Israel, chose me of all my father's house to be king over Israel forever," etc., etc. He preferred to make me king over all of Israel and all of my sons, for many of the sons of God gave me. He chose my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. And he said to me, it will be your son Solomon who will build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be a son to me, and I will be a father to him. I will establish his kingdom forever if he keeps firmly to the observance of my commandments and rules as he does now. Okay, so King David, just this idea that why did King David not build the temple in Jerusalem? Because he was a man of battles and shed blood, right? That the temple, again, was supposed to be a haven of peace and love. And therefore, we have, again, another slight, allusion to how we are supposed to imagine war. Now, Maimonides comes a little later, and he takes some of these passages from the Torah, and he goes, as he does with Mishnah Torah, which we could do a whole class on Mishnah Torah, that would be interesting, which is basically his take on all the laws of the Torah and his interpretations. He goes and he takes some of the things that I just referenced and expands on them a little. So I wanted to share a few of those because I thought they're interesting. When we besiege a city which we want to capture, we do not encircle it from all four sides, but only on three. We leave one side open for them to flee. Anyone who wishes to escape with his life may so do as it says, and you shall deploy against Midian as God had commanded Moses. By tradition, we have learned that this is what was meant. Okay, so this is also his take and his interpretation, trying to maybe lessen some of the harshness of the story that we just read, right? Which is his interpretation of this passage, and you shall deploy against Midian as God has commanded, is that there's at least an out. For the people who want to escape, there's an out. And anytime we go into battle, we should not make it impossible for people to escape if they want to, but people who really want to escape with their life should be given that opportunity, right? In other words, even in modern day, this idea of a corridor for civilians and others who want to escape. Lisa, see your hand up. Lisa Beth Harris.
Hello, hi. Can you
Hi.
hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have your screen on, so I can't see you guys. I just have a question about that. There you guys are. Hi, sorry. So when Israel, do you happen to know this? When Israel does a war strategy, do you happen to know if they follow that by leaving a corridor open?
I don't know all the details, but we are going to get to something that does have to do with the state of Israel and their military in a minute.
I was just curious if that's something that, was one of those.
I assume
things
that I can't speak for it for sure. You may be able to go online and find all the details of there, but we are going to talk a little bit about how some of these rules have been adapted into the modern state.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I do have an answer for that. Israel provided trucks to remove the Kurds, I think, that when this war was going on in Syria, and they were attacking the people that lived there that weren't Muslim. So Israel actually provided trucks to remove these people from the dangerous areas so they won't be slaughtered and killed. The Kurds, I think it was, right? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ben.
I know historically in the Six-Day War that when the Israeli army had encircled the Egyptian army, actually in Egypt, they didn't slaughter them, but they did let them kind of escape. So maybe some connection there.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, so let's get to that. A couple little smaller ones before we get to it, which is we may besiege a non-Jewish city on Shabbos and may make war with them even on Shabbos, as it says, until it falls. We do battle on Shabbos, whether it is a war of mitzvot or a discretionary war. Interesting take from Maimonides. We may encamp anywhere. One who is killed in battle is buried wherever he falls, for he acquires that spot, as would a mitzvot. So you don't have to carry someone out of the battlefield. They can be buried right there. And this is an interesting one. It is forbidden to relieve oneself within the camp or just anywhere in the field. Rather, it is a positive commandment to set up a latrine where the people may go and relieve themselves. Okay, so even in battle, it's the importance of setting up cleanliness and a separate space outside the camp to relieve yourself. So I'm going to skip this part. This is about basically the rabbis of old really didn't spend a lot of time thinking about military matters. That's why there's not a ton written about it. They didn't live through most military wars, and they didn't deal with most of that. That wasn't their day-to-day life. And by example, as Rabbi Stahl points out, even the book of Maccabees, which is full of more detailed war stories, is not included in the canon. And the rabbis themselves even move away from the discussion about war in the book of Maccabees and instead focus on the miracle of the oil. And if you remember that the famous song from camp, but also comes from the Haftorah read during Hanukkah, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit alone, right? So we have that famous line too, right? So that there is, again, a reminder that battle and war and power is not the only way to secure success. Now, tohar haneshek, that is the Israeli phrase used for this idea of purity of arms. It is in the IDF, in basically their Bible, so to speak, for all the soldiers. It also came even in the Haganah, Israel's pre-state army charter, which said, self-defense is our right and obligation. With all our might, we shall cling to it as long as the need persists. but we shall also be diligent in preserving its purity and rightness. Any misuse of this right harms this most holy of undertakings and renders our defense defective. Our strength lies in the purity of our aspirations and the rightness of our deeds. So even before the state of Israel was established, the pre-state army was already thinking about the morals and ethics of battle and of war, and of making sure that there was a system in place and principles in order to engage in a values-based war, so to speak. And some of those principles that are even today, you can find these online: preventing the misuse of weapons, using minimum force against combatants, preventing casualties to civilians, appropriate care for prisoners, resisting dehumanization and demonization of enemy citizenry, dealing with criminal orders, and equalizing the burden of military service on the whole of the population. Okay, so these are some of the things, and you can find them in more detail online. But these are built in and baked into the IDF even today, right? Of course, they're not always followed, as is the case with everything, right? But we also have the Geneva Accords on a global scale. This idea that there is a set standard in which we should engage in warfare on a regular basis, but that Israel itself, in many ways, based on a Jewish value system, has established its own set of rules of conduct that are taken very seriously in the Israeli military. Lisa Beth, and then Susan.
Yeah, sorry again. Hi. Well, I just thought of something, this is a sort of a side tangent about the IDF, but unfortunately, because Israel has to spend so much money and energy on defense, their PR has never been their primary focus. And if somehow what you just read got out to the world about what underpins the IDF, it would be amazing for Israel, because most of the world, unless they're doing Torah study, don't know that the IDF is actually based on anything. They just think it's just one more army. Yeah. I mean, I didn't know this, and I've been, a Jew for a few years now, and I didn't know that, that the army was based on such a specific code. Although, our military has the military code of conduct, but just because Israel's, unfortunately, the perception is so skewed, they should be doing something with this. Yeah. In some kind of campaign to let people know that there's a deeper issue at stake. Because
they're trying very hard. There is a lot of high-rank people coming to United States and meeting with the Jewish community and actually telling us and teaching us of things that they do. There is a whole unit of boys, young men that are in a special unit because they come from broken homes, and there is abuse there and a lot of rage, and they are going through a lot of psychiatric work to learn how to depend on each other and trust each other, because if you don't do that when you are in the army, then we are in trouble. So they actually literally have those units in Beit She'an, and they are telling, come here, and those are even in the army, in the Israeli army, which are not even Jewish. And they are all involved in this building, first of all, healthy people and healthy relationship with each other before they go into the army. And they have to defend each other from an enemy that's a common enemy. So there is a lot of thought taken and putting into human behavior toward anybody, and to start with.
Right. And yeah, no, I know that. I'm talking about promoting it so that people...
They're trying, but the world is going to believe wherever they want to believe, wherever it's comfortable for them at the same point. It's the same moment, and that's it.
You both
They're trying to teach the whole world to change their way, their mind. I watched a show that was called The Crown, and they're teaching and they're telling the story of Britain giving finally freedom to South Africa, and they're giving freedom to Nigeria, and they were given freedom to India and Egypt, and not one word about Israel being occupied underneath them, and all the boys that are hung at Akko for trying to defend Israel from whoever it is that wanted to harm them at the time.
All right,
And
and I want
they
to make
had
sure.
to bomb the King David Hotel to finally get attention, and not one word in the whole series of The Crown about them occupying Israel and killing our boys there. That's that.
Thank you. But yes, Penina makes good points. Lisa, you're right. Lisa Beth, there, if only more people were aware of the IDF's ethics system. So I suggest all of you read up on it and be able to talk to people about it as well, because at least, one person at a time is sometimes the best way to do this. Susan and then Brad.
Yes, that they've had trouble with the HaShavuah, their outreach for some time, unfortunately. And I agree with Penina that people are going to believe what they want to believe, and you see this unfortunately all over. I'm going to ask one thing. This is an abrupt thing, but you brought up Chronicles. So tell me that's in the Tanakh, but not in the Torah.
Correct.
So I mean, it's like Ruth and Proverbs and all the others that are in there. So remind me historically, how does that fit in? How is it perceived? It's not an apocrypha yet, but is it? And it isn't, because it's in the Tanakh.
Yeah, it chronicles mostly the stories of the kings of Israel, and it's found in the it's found in the Tanakh, right? But it's considered historical, but also more of, again, like the book of Joshua, the history of what happens to the Jewish people once they've entered the land of Israel, right? And so it's a later time period. So it's still considered legitimate because it's included in the canon, but it's referenced at various times of the year, but it's not read specifically on a certain holiday like the book of Ruth is, right? So, but it's same with the book of Joshua, which is not read at any particular time, but also chronicles the rise of Joshua, who takes over for Moses when they enter the land of Israel. So it actually would be another class would be great for us to start looking beyond just the 5 books. Let's get into Joshua. Let's get into Chronicles. Then we start to see a little bit more of the history that goes beyond our journey to the land of Israel.
And how is it rated? I mean, in terms of, it's not rated as canonical because it's not in the Torah. Oh, actually it is, because it's in the Tanakh. But, and we know it comes later because there has to be some historical perspective on the kings. But, how is that different from Shmuel, from Samuel and Kings, and who wrote it, Friedman hasn't written about that yet, I don't think.
Yeah. David, did you want to
answer that?
Yeah.
But what I think one of the things that characterizes those sections we're talking about, Yahweh doesn't really appear too often. So one of the differences is God is very present in the 5 books of Moses. As you go on, it's much more like history and a narrative of the future of the people. Yahweh's presumed to be there, but Yahweh's not interfering or engaging as much as.
That's a great way of describing it.
Thank you.
If we think of the Torah as a theological text, right, then you get into Chronicles, Samuel, Joshua, that's a little bit more historical than it is theological. Whereas there are historical things that happen in the Torah, but it's not a historical document. It's not supposed to be read as such either. Good question. Thanks, Susan. Brad.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about this art of war as waged by the Hebrews here against the Midianites, and comparing it, for example, to the way the ancient Romans conducted wars. Romans who built an empire over centuries and were very successful at it. And the way they were successful is that they didn't destroy. In fact, they maintained the locals in powers positions of authority and vassalized them. So this could have gone very, very differently in our tradition, but it didn't. And you have to wonder why, because it basically it wasn't successful. Whereas the Romans found a way to accomplish a vast empire and maintain it peaceably over centuries.
No, I would argue, Brad, the Romans are not around anymore, and we still are, right? So if anything,
Well,
so maybe there's something about the way that we went about this that, you know, the Romans were very successful, clearly built an empire larger than anything else that we could ever imagine from a Jewish perspective. And yet I was just in Rome a month ago and saw the Arch of Titus and looked up and thought, that is all that remains of Titus and that empire. And here I am with my daughters and my wife taking a picture of it, walking right next to it, and blessed that is not the symbol, that is now only an archaeological symbol and not a representation of what happened to the Jewish people. So in some ways, militaristically, maybe you are correct. And yet in the large span of history, somehow we have managed, our strategy somehow worked one way or another. But good points. Yes, thank you. Okay, I want to keep going because we've gotten, I just want to point out this idea of the cities of refuge, because it is another really important point that comes with what we just focused on comes from Matot, and now we're into Massei, which is the last. Massei's journey. This is, again, the beginning of the Torah portion is the various stops that the Israelites took on their way to the promised land. But there is this interesting idea that we find in this last Torah portion, and it is first referenced in Exodus, where it says, "One who fatally strikes another party shall be put to death. If a man did so, but not by design, it came about by an act of God, I will assign you a place to which he can flee." Okay, that's a little precursor and foreshadowing to what we find in this week's Torah portion, where God says, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall provide yourselves with places to serve you as cities of refuge, to which a man who has killed someone, who has slain a person unintentionally, may flee. The cities shall serve you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the killer may not die unless he has stood trial before the assembly. The towns that you thus assign shall be 6 cities of refuge in all. 3 cities shall be designated beyond the Jordan, and the other 3 shall be designated in the land of Canaan." So 3 in the land of Israel, 3 outside. "They shall serve as cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall serve the Israelites and the resident aliens among them for refuge, so that any man who slays a person unintentionally may flee there. Anyone, however, who strikes another with an iron object so that death results is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death." Through a list of all the different ways in which someone does actually get put to death because they're a murderer. Let's see. And by the way, then the blood avenger, it's the person who was the family who was affected, the victim's family, who gets to actually do the killing, not the government, so to speak. The assembly shall protect, here we go. "But if a man pushed without malice aforethought, or hurled an object at the victim unintentionally, or inadvertently dropped upon the victim any deadly object of stone, and death resulted, though not being an enemy and not seeking to harm, in such cases the assembly shall decide between the slayer and the blood avenger. And the assembly shall protect the killer from the blood avenger, and the assembly shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled, and there he shall remain until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the sacred oil. But if the killer ever goes outside the limits of the city of refuge to which he has fled, and the blood avenger comes upon him outside the limits of his city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills that killer, there is no blood guilt on his account. For you must remain inside his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. After the death of the high priest, the killer may return to his land holding." Okay, so really interesting here. Those who commit manslaughter, who kill unintentionally, are given a space, 6 cities where they can flee, where they can go, they're put on trial there. And if they are found to be not guilty of murder, then they get to stay in that city and protected from the victim's family who potentially wants to kill them. And if they leave that city, the family of the victim can do that and won't be held accountable. But if they stay in the city until the high priest dies, so who knows how long that could be, they could be in there for a very, very long time. They could be in there a short amount of time. Once the high priest dies, then they are protected even when they leave the city of refuge, and then they can go back to their home, right? But until then, they have to stay in that city. So it's an interesting form of justice that our tradition is setting up here for someone to be protected if they kill someone accidentally, that they shouldn't be killed themselves by the victim's family. So I wanted to just point that out. You can do more research and learn more about it, but I do think it's an important little piece of justice that our tradition throws in there. At the end of the book of Numbers, we'll have more references to justice and to ethics in the book of Deuteronomy. Justice shall you pursue. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof will come up. We have the Shema. A variety of wonderful things await us in the book of Deuteronomy as we get closer and closer to starting all over again and finding our place within this tradition. So thank you all. Shabbat shalom. Thank you again, as always, for all your insights and questions. And really wonderful to see all of you, and have a wonderful Shabbat. See you soon.
Thank
Good
you.
Shabbos.
Shalom.
Good
Thank
Shabbos.
you.
Shabbat
Thank you
shalom.
so much. Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.